So my name's Jasleen Kaur. I'm an artist based in London, and the title of the work is The First Thing I Did Was to Kiss the Ground, which is going to be sited at Gravesend and is in partnership with Cement Fields.
Great, and so that's a very intriguing title. Whereabouts in Gravesend will the work be located?
It's going to be really close to the water, so Gravesend, I guess that's what was so interesting about that site. Gravesend kind of looks onto Tilbury Dock, which is still a functioning dock, so you're right by the water, and the sculpture is going to be accompanied by a sound work, so they're both going to be really in proximity to the water and each other, right by the terminal, the ferry terminal dock, which takes you across to the pontoon that takes you across to Tilbury Docks. So yeah, as close to on the water as was possible is where the work's going to be.
And so we're going to talk a bit more about the whole motivation behind the work, but how would you try and summarize that quickly, I guess?
Good question. It's difficult to do that when it's been going on for so many years, and yeah, but I guess it's really thinking about the histories of migration to Gravesend and the communities that exist and live within Gravesend now today. So I guess my head's been really sitting in that expanse of time, and also entering into it from quite a personal place as someone who is a product of very specific migration due to colonization of India. So I'm entering this from a really personal place, but also kind of, I think wherever it is that I'm moving around the country or asked to, if I'm invited to engage in a project there, I'm kind of questioning about that anyway in the site, like, you know, who is the community here and how do they end up in a place and what, and I'm kind of, I feel like maybe it's like a cartography, I'm like mapping this throughout, just out of like being compelled to do it, but I notice the kind of similarities and also the things that are specific to those towns or those sites that are different to like where I grew up in Glasgow, for example.
Right. So even though this is the first work you've made for or working with the people of Gravesend, you're finding similar reference points there as you've done in other towns and places. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I guess so. Gravesend specifically, like I'm thinking about, obviously Tilbury Dock is where the Empire Windrush came in, but there's also there's something that is maybe shared across the UK, which is that kind of 1950s male migration that happened from the colonies, from India specifically, that I can definitely track kind of my family or friends' migration to Britain. But it was like post World War II, post independence of India / partition of India. So there's that kind of these, I guess, those big monumental shifts that and that creating this kind of dispersal of people or this movement of people that, yeah, I guess that's what I mean about these things that I can see as similar, these patterns of where communities start to cluster. Mm-hmm. And in Gravesend, as you know, and as we, you know, we're in conversation a lot with, there's a huge Sikh community in Gravesend, and that was obviously a particular like entry point to the work of like tapping into that, you know, why does Gravesend have the largest Sikh Gurdwara in the whole of Europe? Like, why does that exist there in this town? So yeah, there were kind of things that were asking me to kind of like have those conversations and dig a little bit deeper as to into those communities, into that community, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the work, there are two aspects to the work, as you say. There's the sculpture and there's a sound work, but both works are very much focused, I think, or make reference very much to the Sikh community that's there, or to the Sikh culture at least. Could you describe the sculpture perhaps, and the sound work, and the reference points that are there within it, integrated in there?
Yeah, so the sculpture, it kind of looks like this quite graphical wave of water, a rectangular kind of slice through a wave of water that is rendered in like a faux marble, quite a high gloss finish.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a head coming out of that wave that has long hair tied up into a bun, a top knot of hair on the top. And maybe I can come back to that in a moment, but the sound work is made in collaboration with the artist Aine Bailey, and we were working with this the Saheli women's group who are based in Gravesend. Yeah, there's so much to say about both of those, but I came across the Saheli women's group during the research phase of this project. I came across their books in the local studies library. They were self-organized in the early 90s, and they were self-publishing these incredibly beautiful books that there's different ones over the years of them working together, but they're essentially like testimonies of first and second wave generation of South Asian women who lived in the town, and had other books which were recipe books called the Saheli Kitchen, and they still kind of operate today. They run a lot of, they have this kind of weekly roster of activity that happens in the town for women, and they're usually, I guess there's a lot of cultural activity, there's a lot of song and dance, but they're kind of quite unstructured in that they are they have their own agency, so they're not funded. They kind of do stuff by themselves and do what's needed as and when. So I was kind of really interested in thinking about where do community gather, and how do community kind of marginalized communities hold on to culture. Feels like too broad a word, but I'm going to use it for now. Like how do things get clung on to, these practices, these rituals, these things that kind of add up to a sense of identity, and whilst trying to find a sense of belonging in a place, in a new place. And the Saheli group and the Gurdwara, and I'm sure so many others in between that, they're kind of examples of like these, I think I was thinking of them like as alternative spaces where knowledge is kind of cultivated and practiced and disseminated, and really thinking about them as like other ways of like other forms of education or supplementary schooling, and thinking about what supplemented my learning growing up, whether it was through language or song or dance or.
So when you found these books in the local library, you knew that, or you really wanted to make a connection with the Saheli women's group, and somehow hoping that would inform the work that you eventually were going to make. That became a really important aspect of the research you were doing, right?
Yeah, it felt I really wanted to reach out to them and involve them in some way, and I think knowing that they didn't have a base, or like they kind of operated from their living rooms, or we had a meeting in a car once, like knowing that was the way that they did things, and in a way they kind of, it reminded me so much of like the women I grew up around, or like kind of wishing that I grew up around as well, that kind of that sense of like the group that they've created and that they nurture, like it really it means a lot to the people that are part of that, or like part of that group. It's like a second family, if not a first family. So there's something really magnetic about them and wanting to work with them. And maybe like coming back to the sculpture, I wanted to touch on like the kind of finish, or like the what was going on there. And I guess like I was thinking a lot about I'm really drawn to materials or aesthetics that kind of come from those spaces and places, whether it's like the home, or the like the British Asian home, or that that Gurdwara aesthetic, where there's, I call them like, or I've called them in the past, I've called them aspirational materials. They're often like not quite the thing that they were, and maybe they were never trying to be that thing. It was never, you know, the marble paintwork in the Gurdwara and Gravesend was never trying to be marble, but it's this kind of a version of something, and I'm interested in those aesthetics.
That's very clear in the works, and how it's you can sort of feel that that's an important aspect of the work and what you're thinking about, and the relationship with the Gurdwara that you wanted to somehow bring into the work. And then there was something else that from at the beginning of this process that we've now been going through for 2 or 3 years, to do with, I think, Sikh culture and the ceremonial palki. That was something that was really important in informing your first ideas for the project, I think.
Yeah. The palki is like a flotilla, I guess, or like, well, it isn't, but there's moments of like ceremony in the year. We've just passed it, actually, Vaisakhi, which marks a particular moment in the Sikh calendar, and my relationship to that is that we would you take part in a procession around the town. So in Glasgow, and they do it in Gravesend. Obviously the pandemic's meant that none of that can really happen, but the Palki is this, it's a housing for the Guru Granth Sahib, for the Sikh holy book, but it sits on a back of a van so that it can be moved around the city, and the parade would be behind that that structure. And so yeah, I was thinking about that conceptually, but also maybe like physically and aesthetically of what that form is, but thinking about like moments where like things that are private kind of spill out into the public space. Or, you know, I've got really vivid memories of taking part in those yearly events in Glasgow, and like finding yourself under a bridge, and that like the sound from so the palki is generally where there's singing happening as well. So there's a mic'd up system, and the speakers are going, and everyone's singing in the procession. But yeah, these kind of moments where like it's almost like a real kind of collision of like something that's not meant to be in that space, or that just does exist in those spaces now. Like it's a real, I think it's something that I do a lot in my work, and where things kind of are asked to be brought together when they're maybe not supposed to be, or there's an unexpectedness to it, but also a kind of yeah, it's speaking to like a reality of like these hybrid things or identities. And
yeah, I think that was one thing that I really noticed about your work before we really met, that you were interested in bringing together objects or ideas from a range of different cultures and a range of different timescales even, and making a new thing. And that seems to be something, an area that you're really exploring in your work, that you've really pushed in this project, because the sculpture is definitely a new thing. It's an abstract form, I think, but at the same time there's something very figurative about it. It's quite clearly the top of a head that you're looking at, but you have to ask yourself what it's emerging from, why it seems to be emerging from a block of something that could be water, but that is painted to look like a sort of faux marble. It's a really intriguing object that you've made, and we're speaking now just as the work itself is being completed and just before it's installed. So how do you feel about coming to this point in this process?
Relieved. I'm really excited to see. I've actually also just listened to the first mix of the sound work earlier today from Aine, so I'm excited to, because this work has like spanned such an incredible amount, like moment in time over the pandemic, and I think I'm excited to see the works, you know, come together and really just experience that actually, and see what that kind of like care over that period of time, or the conversations and the work with the Saheli Women's Group through these workshops over the pandemic, which were meant to happen in real life, but then, you know, got pushed onto Zoom. You know, that all of that kind of, all of those conversations, really seeing how that sits together, or how that materializes together, and what it brings up for other people, because I think it will be, yeah, I think it'll be able to be read from lots of different angles.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's, as we've discussed, there are many reference points within the work to do with that community, but also relating to migration of people, you know, the diaspora of cultures across the world, and how people integrate within communities that they arrive to, I suppose. And that's so specific in Gravesend as a town. I mean, how do you feel about Gravesend now? I mean, I don't think it's a town you were that familiar with when we began this project, but you've come to know it over this period of time, and you've collaborated with people that are based there, and that seems another really important aspect to your work. I mean, bringing things together, and bringing people together through lots of different kinds of events and processes. That's obviously been integral to the process of making this work in Gravesend.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I guess I was just beginning to say, like, you know, that there was like a real hope to spend more time in Gravesend, and with the Saheli women, and in their living rooms recording these, you know, having these conversations and running these workshops, which were, maybe I could speak a little bit about that. So I invited Aine to work with me on this, because I know that Aine's has this incredible, runs these incredible workshops, or facilitates these, like, they're like sonic biography workshops, which essentially is what that looks like in real time, is people coming together and sharing a sound or a song that has some kind of meaning for the individual, and then we listen together, which is a really active process, and then there's a bit of discussion after each listening about why that sound or why that song. And what was so beautiful about working with the Sahelis, despite it being online, is that they sing a lot, which has been, so actually the sessions were just so stunning, and that they're all incredible vocalists, and singing is something that I guess, like, the songs that they sang, some of them were folk songs, some of them are more like Bollywood type songs, but there was something that was kind of like, I was thinking about the sound as, like, maybe I'm thinking a lot about archive at the moment, or a way of, like, how do we document ourselves, and I guess the Sahelis have been doing that through their books in the early 90s, but this the sound, maybe it actually kind of gathers these songs that are, you know, one of them was, Sharon was telling me in the session that this song is actually 100 years old, and you can kind of plot that, who sang it, whose grandmother sang it to who, and it kind of travels down and then it travels across to Gravesend, and so yeah, I think I'm still working the sound out, although because I'm kind of in the process with Eileen of editing that, but I'm thinking about actually, to what you just said about integration, I'm also thinking about like what it means to hold on to culture and what it means to resist assimilation, or when there's such a kind of rhetoric around like about yeah, becoming neutral or not, kind of, or of things which are of difference. Anything that makes your identity slightly different can be a real threat.
Yeah.
Language, tongue, sound, food, and really noticing this also in the local studies library at Gravesend, like coming back to the Balgi, there's accounts of like the first Gurdwara setting up in people's homes, and Sunday mornings being this moment of like joyful praise and very loud singing and playing of instruments, and how that disturbed the Sunday morning peace, I think was one of the quotes. And yeah, just I guess just I think that's what I mean when I said earlier about like thinking about community and how community kind of, it creates a space for things to be practiced, for things to be kind of like when you think about how something lives on, whether we want to call it a ritual or not, like it's got to be practiced so that someone else can inherit that. And just thinking about how community in those spaces, be it the living room or the kind of impressive Gurdwara, they're like spaces that facilitate that, and they allow some form of resistance in some way. Yeah.
Wow. So no, I was going to say, in addition to that, how or coming or thinking about that, those workshops, what that then resulted in. So, for those reasons, bringing together communities and singing and passing these rituals on and down. I'm imagining that's why collaboration is such an important aspect of your practice, in some way. But maybe you could, I was going to ask two questions, one about that, and then what we might then hear, what our visitors and audiences are going to expect to hear in the sound work when they encounter
it. Yeah. Maybe I'll speak to collaboration first. I think when I started to collaborate, I didn't know that I was doing it. Like, I don't think I knew that. I think it was many years later that someone might have mentioned social practice to me, and I might have had to like Google it or whatever. But I don't think I started to work with those that were in proximity to me, so my family, and I'm trying to, maybe at that time, 12, 13 years ago, I was interested in like, well, that was the knowledge bank, right? Like that was the reference library, that was the place to go to, as well as like reading Said or Stuart Hall. Like that was, I don't know, for me those knowledges are not, there's no hierarchy in that. So that's, I think that's one way in which like collaboration came about. But I just really enjoy conversation. Like I feel like I'm someone that I make, and I'm not a theorist, I'm not an academic. Like the way I learn is through conversation and being in discussion with people, or being active, whether that's making in the studio or talking over a cup of tea. Like that's where the work kind of happens, or so I think it feels like, sometimes it feels like research, but then sometimes it feels like practice, and then maybe sometimes it's outcome as well, all at the same time.
So it's a more natural, it's kind of just naturally what you do.
Yes.
And produce and produce things from that, either in the form of film or sound work or whatever, and then at other times in the form of objects that have presumably kind of come to mind through that research, through those conversations, and then result in you wanting to physically make something that manifests visually what you kind of been researching. Is that
I wish it was that clear cut for me on this end. Like, I think, yeah, sometimes, but it's obviously never that linear, and and maybe it should never be. But yeah, I think there's a lot of looping that happens, and maybe also like with this Saheli women's group, like they're really kind of on the margins, right? Like they're not a kind of, they're not funded in any way, or and I'm kind of
it's an informal group, you mean? It's not a formally constituted group of people, and you quite often work or think about groups of people that are uninformally brought together, or sort of in a non-formal way, right?
Yeah, or that are bound by friendships or other kind of like things that for them are like real reasons for something to keep going. Like I think that there's a lot of this kind of long-term intergenerational friendships and love within the Saheli women's group that you know, what if that was the way that we structured things, or what about if that was the way that what if that was given value as much as other structures. So I think I'm drawn to that. And you asked another question that I can't.
Oh, just it was kind of coming out of that to think about if you could describe what people might hear when they hear the result of those workshops with the Saheli group on the sound work.
I guess I was thinking, I think the words that I have been sitting with are like ceremony, but also like maybe dissonance and harmony, like, you know, something that might move between those things, something that's settling but also unsettling at moments, or that kind of has a slightly different energy to it. But you will hear the songs that have been sung in the workshops, and there's also, you know, something that's really exciting and about the location of the sound work. It sits on like the kind of waiting shelter of where you'd wait for the ferry, which is on the pontoon, so you can feel the water under you. Well, you're moving, which is just, it's really kind of, I love that you're kind of off the land in a way, and that you can hear the water around you as well. So the sound work's going to try and mirror that in some way, maybe in the same way like the wave mirrors the wave of the water that it sits on. Maybe this repetition of something that's happening, or like this, something that's repeating.
So you'll have seen the sculpture on the way down to the ferry shelter, so you'll have that in your mind, and then you'll hear these voices, I guess, singing a number of different songs. Maybe, I don't know, there as Zane Bailey sort of edit them together in a montage, or how is
we're still literally, I've heard the first edit of it. I think there's at moments they come together and overlap, but there's also some space in between them as well, which allows you to kind of, it really reminds me actually of the experience of sitting in a congregation, and of kind of each person singing in turn, and but moments where the voices join up, and there's a kind of kind of ecstatic feeling of people singing together. But when you're sitting with the sound work, you can actually gaze back at the sculpture, which is, it's really lovely that there's this direct relationship between the two works, which was unplanned in a way, or kind of difficult to plan in a way, but really nice that it's occurred.
That sounds fantastic. And is it the first time you've worked in such a public excuse me, is it the first time you've worked in such a public space, a presented work in that way, or is that something you've done before? Did you feel it was something that you kind of understood?
It feels like a really new process, in that it's kind of like tracking back in my mind a little bit. It feels like a really new process to make something of that scale, of that presence that sits outside, that's in a public space, which is the thing that really excited me about this commission.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for the gallery goer, it's for someone driving past or someone on their way to work. And I think some works that I've done in the past are very deliberately trying to like get out of that, get out of the white walled gallery space and be elsewhere. But I think, in terms of this feeling like it's being sited in a town for a kind of long duration of time, and that's being considered the whole way through, about who's going to be interacting or engaging with it, or who do we want to be a part of this conversation, or who should we be reaching out to be a part of this conversation. Just felt like something that there was a lot of time and energy to spend on that, I guess. So yeah, it feels new in a lot of ways, definitely.
And has that become something that you've thought about that you might want to then make part of your practice in the future? Or is it, it's such a different way of working, I guess, making something that's going to be in a public space as opposed to a gallery or more private space?
Yeah. I'm really interested in just even the politics of taking up public space, and that sits back. Yeah, I think what I was saying earlier about that thing about that memory of sound, the memory of like sound from home or sound from a private space being out in public. There's something about that that taking up of public space that's just really intriguing to me, and inviting us to do that with you is really exciting as well.
Well, it's interesting when you think of it in comparison with other monuments or works of art that sit in public spaces all over our towns and cities all over the world, and the question marks that have been raised around those over the last year. That's something that's kind of really entered into everybody's consciousness, thinking about what and who those monuments might be about or for, who is behind putting them there in the first place. And I guess with this work, it's a temporary work, it is figurative, and it kind of makes reference to a whole range of times and people and places, but it takes a different approach to those other kinds of sculptures in public places, but I think it's also in dialogue with them somehow. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the word monument or a memorial of some sort in relation to this work. I've never, as you know, like I've never called it that, or like I think maybe my attention was just slightly in a different direction, or I was paying attention to something else rather than it being a counter memorial or in dialogue with. But I am interested in like who's being brought into question, or I was going to say represented, but that maybe isn't the right word, but who's being remembered, or who's being who's present in that work feels like yeah, feels really at the centre of the work actually, or in that work, with both the sculpture and the sound together. And also nearby the other public monuments, the Boji sculpture of the Sikh squadron leader and Queen Elizabeth, have I got that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is this kind of relationship to like the public sculpture and how someone might how someone might read it or come across it, and how they might. I think it's got a really different aesthetic. I think it's not going to be confused as like, but yeah, but yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how what comes up once it is in public, like how it's reacted to and how it's received is like the whole other chunk of this piece of work, isn't it? Something that
absolutely
impossible to plan in a way.
Well, I think it's a really important aspect of what we're doing through this whole series of commissions. As you know, that this work is one of 7 commissions around the southeast coast, all of which in some way take on the idea of a monumental aspect to sculpture, I suppose, but certainly by being in the public realm, invite a whole range of audiences to make a response, whether they're people that would normally go to a gallery or are just out for a walk, or who are on a sort of trail, on a pilgrimage maybe, to look at all 7 of the works around the coast. You know, it's going to be really interesting to see what the response is to each individual work, and the way that the way they are all focusing on representing the different histories and communities of the towns that they're based in. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that, or whether you've got any final things you wanted to bring up about the work before we wrap up this conversation.
Just when you were saying that, you made me think about the kind of the conversations we've been having within Gravesend, obviously with the Saheli Women's Group, but also on a kind of at the Gurdwara and then on a council level, and thinking about like how important that side of it is, and actually, because stumbling across, absolutely, but I guess in terms of this work, it's you could stumble across it, but yeah, hoping that like I can still be in dialogue with those groups that we've reached out to, and that might, you know, really welcoming that traffic in a way, or kind of facilitating that in some way. And yeah, just thinking about how that's been such an integral part of this project in so many ways, that kind of that process of listening to the community, and really paying close attention to that in terms of sight, or what the work is saying back to the community, like and so welcoming that viewership, I guess.
What a pleasure and a privilege it's been to work with you on this, and thank you for coming on the journey of doing that. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the work in place, and thank you for having this conversation.